Hello and welcome to the video. Today's gonna be a fun one. I mean, they're always fun, but today's gonna be extra fun. Do you know why? Because we're talking about forced induction motorcycles, baby. Not just turbo busas, but hidden deep inside the cavernous depths of 1980s motorcycle lore lies a secret time when each of the big four were competing neck and neck to produce the best turbocharged motorcycles. Motorcycling in the early 80s was experiencing an awkward phase where the rider demographic was shifting, and with that, the demand of the market. The big four had made the same UJM style bikes for the 10 years prior, so it was determined that the best way to reignite interest was to take smaller and lighter motorcycles and slap a turbo on them, because why not? Turbos are cool, the whistle of the spool is intoxicating, and it's essentially free power. Also, it was the 80s, so there was a lot of cocaine in turbos. It was a good time. Unfortunately, these turbocharged bikes weren't all sunshine and rainbows. There were countless reasons they fell into obscurity within just a few years of being initially released. In today's video, we'll talk about the bikes that each of the big four brought to the table, what made them so cool, and why they ultimately failed. So strap in, because we're about to spool some boost, baby. Today's video is sponsored by Rockform. I'll tell you more about them later in the show. Before we jump in, I want to remind you all that our Royal Enfield Interceptor 650 giveaway is wrapping up on October 14th. So if you want to get entered to win, be sure to head over to yamanoob.co to sign up or grab some gear from shop.yamanoob.co, where every dollar you spend gets you entered to win. Don't miss it. Okay, let's get into it. The year was 1982. I wasn't alive yet, but from what I can gather from the contrived stereotypes portrayed on television shows, it was pretty sweet. Mullets, children smoking, and those brown digital alarm clocks that everyone had. But more importantly, turbochargers were making their way onto the automotive scene. As the 70s were coming to a close, many European car manufacturers were finding success implementing turbochargers on their car. A turbocharger, for those of you that don't know, has two parts. There is a hot side that utilizes a small turbine that is spun by exhaust gases. This turbine spins a compressor on the cold side that sucks air into the engine. This creates pressure, also known as boost. That leads to a substantial increase in power as compressed air is forced into the engine with appropriate fueling. Companies like Mercedes, BMW, and Porsche set the standard for production model cars with forced induction in the 1980s. While adding complexity, a turbocharged engine makes more power with fewer emissions, and as more high-end brands like Ferrari and Bugatti began utilizing this technology, turbochargers became thought of as an exotic luxury. This period coincidentally aligned with looming Reagan-era import tariffs on motorcycles with engines larger than 700cc, a plea from Harley-Davidson to maintain a hold on the American motorcycle market. I'm not sure if there is a direct correlation between those tariffs and the desire to make smaller turbocharged motorcycles, but I felt like it was worth pointing out as the timing is pretty interesting. Also, baby Harley needed to go cry to the government to save them. What else is new? But either way, regardless of whether this was a coincidence or not, by the 1980s, motorcycle manufacturers were ushering in a new era, and it seemed that that era would be of forced induction. Honda was the first manufacturer to ignite the turbo fad in 1982 by bringing a turbocharged production motorcycle to the scene, the CX500T. This bike was based on the existing CX500 platform, famous for its longitudinal V-twin that had extended out horizontally out of the frame out of the bike. This water-cooled 4-valve engine had just 497 cc's of displacement. Honda's goal was to make a smaller, lighter bike, making the power equivalent to that of a liter bike. The CX500T was pretty advanced for motorcycles at the time. Not only was it Honda's first motorcycle to be equipped with the turbo, but it was also their first production motorcycle to have electronic fuel injection. It had dual disc brakes in the front and a rear disc as well, which doesn't sound groundbreaking by today's standards, but it was pretty high-end in 1982. Also, 1982 was 40 years ago. What? Honda was successful in making the turbocharged model significantly more powerful than its naturally aspirated brother. The turbocharger on the CX500T made 19 pounds of boost and pushed the horsepower to 82, nearly 35 more than the standard model. But unfortunately, that didn't make this bike a smashing success. After the initial novelty wore off, riders were left a little unenthused. It was heavy and it didn't handle the way a bike making that much peak power should to instill confidence in the rider. And most detrimental to this motorcycle was the horrendous turbo lag. Every turbo will have a little bit of lag as it spools up and builds boost, but the difference in power between on and off boost on the CX500T was so drastic it made it awkward to ride spiritedly. It was a very complex motorcycle at the time and came with a price tag to reflect that. Ultimately, the consensus was that the added cost wasn't worth the novelty of having turbo embossed on the motorcycle, and Honda went back to the drawing board.
Okay, real talk, how many of you are watching this video on your phone sitting on the toilet at work right now? Don't worry, I don't judge. I'm happy to hang out with you during your toilet time, parasocially of course. I'm not going to actually keep you company when you're dumping up the John, but do me a favor, look down. What do you see? Probably a floor tile, maybe concrete. Now imagine you just dropped your phone on the ground. What's the over-under on you picking up that to discover a cracked screen or a messed up camera lens? Pretty high, right? Well, not if you put it in a rock-formed case, you dingus. Rock-formed phone cases are drop-tested from 6 feet and pack solid protection in a sleek package. Better still, it mounts up to Rockform's handy-dandy handlebar mount. They've even got a ball mount if you want to hook it up to a GPS mount. And I could go in-depth on the spec. Get yourself some next-level phone protection on the cheap when you click the link down below and use the code YN25 for 25% off your order. Thanks to Rockform for supporting today's video.
Now back to the show. Shortly after Honda released their first turbocharged motorcycle, Yamaha released the Gpz750 Seika Turbo in 1982. This motorcycle utilized the same engine platform as their existing Gpz650 and lacked many of the modern features that Honda had on the CX500T. The 653cc inline-4 engine was air-cooled and carbureted. This created a whole mess of fueling issues for the Seika, which just further exacerbated the already poor turbo lag. Yamaha's turbo contribution was outdated in other ways too. Unlike Honda's rear monoshock, the XJ Turbo had your standard UJM dual rear shocks, which didn't do it any favors for high-speed handling. This motorcycle did make significantly more power than the Honda, around 90 horsepower and 81 foot-pounds of torque, but it still managed to be slower in a head-to-head comparison. Not to mention that it was still rocking a drum brake in the rear, which made high-speed braking less efficient as well. Both the Seika Turbo from Yamaha and the CX500T from Honda rode more like touring bikes with soft suspension, high curb weight, and that awkward turbo lag. But just like the Honda, the Seika was also prohibitively expensive. Riders were essentially given bikes that were initially exciting because of the new technology, but equally heavier, slower, more complicated, and more expensive than a naturally aspirated leader bike at the time. You know what they say, there's no replacement for displacement unless you have a Turbo Busa, then you have displacement and a turbo. Despite the initially poor reception for the first round of turbocharged bikes in 1982, Suzuki and Kawasaki still had turbocharged bikes in the pipeline that were yet to be debuted. In 1983, Suzuki released the XN85, named after the 85 horsepower it produced instead of denoting the displacement. Suzuki also adopted the engine from an existing motorcycle to use in their turbo model. They used a 673cc inline-4 from the GS650. Even though Suzuki used an older engine, so far the XN85 was the sportiest of the turbocharged bikes from the Big Four. It had 16-inch wheels, and it was actually the first production motorcycle in the US to feature a 16-inch front wheel from the factory, race-inspired ergonomics package with rear-set foot pegs and clip-on handlebars. Suzuki also put more emphasis on designing the chassis for the XN85 than Honda or Yamaha had with their bikes, which contributed to a riding experience that was more sport than sport touring. The XN85 was also fuel-injected, but still suffered from dreaded turbo lag, a reality that the Big Four were starting to realize would likely be unavoidable with these smaller displacement engines that revved really high. This bike started to make boosts around 5,000 RPMs, but still never pulled as hard as a leader bike while costing more to own. Suzuki made the XN85 from 1983 until 1985, but it was only sold in the US for the 1985 model year, with just a scant 300 models making their way to the land of freedom and enchantment. So if you ever see one of these for sales, you should probably snatch it up because they're pretty rare. Things were moving fast during the turbo wars, and in 1983, just 1 year after Honda released their misguided CX500T, they released the new and improved CX650T. This bike expanded on the intention of the previous model while attempting to mitigate its shortcomings. Most of the improvements were made to the engine and fueling, which were considered to be the biggest letdown for the previous bike. Honda implemented a larger 673cc engine that increased off-boost power. They also modified the 650 to make less peak boost, and as a result, the turbo lag was detrimental to the riding experience when transitioning between on-boost and off-boost power delivery. Improvements to the fuel injection system also helped smooth that out. This bike was received as a sport touring motorcycle, which made sense considering how much of its DNA it shared with the Honda's GL650 Silverwing. The CX650T was far more refined than the previous 500cc version, but still faced with the issues that had plagued each of the turbocharged motorcycles that had come out prior. It was an expensive novelty that most riders just couldn't justify. If Kawasaki had been good at anything throughout motorcycle history, it's taking what Honda has already done and making it way, way faster. But actually, Kawasaki made a turbocharged motorcycle before the rest of the Big Four. In 1978, 4 years before Honda would release their CX500T at the start of the Turbo War, Kawasaki released a turbocharged version of their famed Z1, the Z1R. Originally designed to compete with the leader bikes that were slowly dethroning the Z1 as the top of the class, the Z1R was literally just a Z1 with a turbocharger and modified carbs and an exhaust system. As a result, the 903cc inline 4 was an absolutely uncontrollable beast. The fueling was snatchy and hard to control, and it quickly jumped between being underpowered and blasting off into space. It was super fast in a straight line, able to do a quarter mile in under 11 seconds, which is bonkers for 1978, but otherwise it was basically unrideable. Kawasaki only made it for 2 model years and it was discontinued in 1979. With this previous experience under the belt and having spent a few years seeing the turbocharged models from the rest of the Big Four fall short, Kawasaki came to battle in 1984 with the Gpz750 Turbo. In typical Kawasaki fashion, they wanted to be the fastest and show the world that they only sell the least amount of bikes because it takes a special kind of hardened thrill seeker to pilot their machines. The Gpz750 Turbo had a 738cc air-cooled inline 4 engine that made the most power out of any of the other contenders at 112 horsepower and 73 foot-pounds of torque. This turbocharged motorcycle made comparable power to the Gpz 1100 with significantly lower displacement. Kawasaki took their time and did it right instead of just turbocharging an existing platform like the rest of the Big Four. They modified components to accommodate the extra power, like low compression pistons and stronger gearbox internals. Sounds familiar to my build. The Gpz had fuel injection, stiffened suspension, and effective braking. It ran a quarter mile in 10.7 seconds, and Kawasaki ran advertisements claiming it to be the fastest production bike in the world. It was determined that without question Kawasaki won the Turbo War with this bike, but unfortunately, their innovation also led to the end of forced induction motorcycles. In 1984, Kawasaki released the original Ninja Gpz 900R and put all thoughts of forced induction motorcycles to rest, at least until they made the H2 in 2015. The naturally aspirated sport bikes that came out subsequently were so fast and innovative, they put an end to the trendy turbo. Thanks for making it to the end of the video. If you've ever had the chance to ride one of these old bikes, definitely let me know in the comments below. I'm super curious to hear your thoughts. As always, take a second to subscribe if you enjoyed the video. I'll see you on the next one, and remember, Turbo Hayabusa or die. Fact: the 1996 film Scream increased the usage of caller IDs in the US. The movie featured a killer who would anonymously call his victims. After the movie debuted, the number of caller ID users instantly tripled in the US. Goodbye.
Keep watching Amy Noob!